Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to Reacteria. Today, we're going to be looking at this video from Matt Powell. Now, if you don't know Matt, he's a young earth creationist that's been making the rounds on a lot of reaction channels lately for, among other things, saying horrible things about LGBT people.
I don't want my kids to grow up in a country where homosexuals are going all over the place and pushing their propaganda and constantly taking and kissing. You know, I don't want my boys to have to see two sodomites kissing each other. I think it should be illegal. It's offensive. It's disgusting.
You don't believe that gay people should be stoned to death, do you?
Well, I believe the Bible puts a death penalty on it. Obviously not by me or by anybody, you know, in our regular society. Obviously, I believe it's the government's job to execute criminals. And, you know, I believe that the Bible says clearly that homosexuality is a criminal crime. It's a crime. It's one of the worst crimes ever.
Is that what you're advocating for? Is that our government should stone gays to death?
I don't, by whatever means they execute people. And obviously I believe in humane, you know, putting to death.
Being loudly wrong about several topics in biology, actually.
Natural selection is something that is required, according to an evolutionist, to keep us alive as a population. But the problem is that natural selection itself cannot stop mutations from getting added to populations over generations. You're either born with male chromosomes or female chromosomes. There is no in between. People today think this is somehow cool and that it's really awesome to go and get a gender change. And the truth is that there are only male chromosomes and female chromosomes. There is no it chromosomes. And just the word it is degrading to another human. But if they're not a male or a female, what are they? Apparently, you don't know much about diamonds because diamonds cannot be penetrated by nature. Nature has no way of penetrating diamonds because they are the toughest subatomic particles that exist in nature. Evolutionists go on all day about how they think DNA could write itself. Well, do you think code could write itself? And they'll say, well, DNA is not code. Scientists say that DNA is a code. So, once again, evolution falsified, creation verified once again.
And editing his debates to make them look like he won them. He even publicly challenged me to a debate not too long ago.
I suspect this is a spam account, but Matt Powell official is in the side chat. I really don't think it's him.
Hell yeah.
He's never been here before, but if it is, good evening, young Matthew. I hope you're doing well. Perhaps Forrest would be up to debate. I'd be nice. He seems really nice. It would be a good conversation, I think.
You know what? If this is actually Matt Powell, I would love to. My name is spelled with 2 R's, but that's just, you know, we can get through that later on. And yeah, I would absolutely love to talk about it because I would also be as nice as I possibly could be. But as I just said a minute ago, I can forgive honest misunderstandings, but when you use your platform to spread horrible, hateful, and venomous messages, we're going to have a problem. And we will absolutely be talking about some of yours. He actually did email me after that. But then he ghosted me after I told him that one of my terms was that we published the entire debate completely unedited. So, oh well, I guess. And for this reason, I kind of hesitated on whether or not I wanted to react to this video at all, because number one, way better channels than mine have already talked about Matt quite a bit, and also, that's his whole business model. He spews hate and ignorance until he gets some attention, and then he gets cheered on by his fans for triggering the atheists. He's basically like an internet troll, but he works way harder for way fewer results. It's just not that interesting, you know? But the point of this whole series is to try to use these toxic videos that are meant to misinform people to try to do some actual good and teach some real science. And this video claims to be about debunking the best evidence for evolution and how genetic mutations are deleterious and educational science. So let's see if we can make a bad thing good today. But before I do, I've got to give a shout out to my patrons on Patreon. You guys are all awesome and you make this dream a reality. And the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN. NordVPN hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection so that you can do things like bank transfers and online shopping even when you're using an unprotected Wi-Fi network. Not to mention the fact that it allows you to trick streaming services into thinking that you're using your computer in all sorts of different countries, which opens up a world of possibilities to watch new cool things that you normally wouldn't have access to before. And the coolest part is, they're offering my subscribers a discount off of a 2-year plan, plus an additional month free that applies to up to 6 different devices on one account, all of which is covered by a 30-day money-back guarantee. Look, the fact of the matter is, you just can't put a price on internet privacy. Except you can, and NordVPN did, and it's about $3 a month. So if you want to take advantage of this deal, or if you just want to help out the channel by checking out this website, you can go to nordvpn.com/ValkaiLabs to learn more. And with that, let's dive right into whatever this is about to be.
So the number one place that evolutionists go to genetically to prove evolution, quote unquote, is mutations. And they'll claim that as genes mutate over time, that means that you'll become a frog to a prince over millions of years.
I'm not sure why we're putting evolution in quotations like that, but whatever. It's hard to tell whether Matt actually means what he's saying there, because the language that he's using is almost certainly deliberately unclear. But just in case that is actually what he meant, and that's how he intended to start this video, individuals do not evolve. An individual might accrue mutations, but they don't evolve. You're not going to turn from a frog to a prince. That makes no sense. Populations evolve. Populations accrue mutations and pass those mutations on to successive generations. So that is what evolution is actually all about. And even that is still just talking about neo-Darwinian evolution, which is the combination of our understanding of natural selection and our understanding of Mendelian genetics. There are other ways beyond that that evolution can occur, but also those don't apply to what Matt's saying here. So just remember, mutation does not equal evolution, and individuals do not evolve.
And they think that mutations somehow create new information.
Mutations are pretty much by definition the creation of new information. Remember, a mutation is any change to the letters or the nucleotide sequence of a stretch of DNA. DNA codes for RNA, which then codes for protein. We call this transcription and then translation. And proteins are made of a sequence of amino acids, which have to be in the right order to make a particular protein. And the RNA is read to make a protein in groups of 3 letters called codons. Each codon codes for a different amino acid. So if I were to change the letters of the DNA, if I were to mutate it, then different codons would be read, different amino acids would be assembled, and a different protein would be made. That is making new information by changing what's already there. It's sort of like how 1 comma can change the sentence, "Let's eat, Grandma," to
"Let's eat Grandma."
It's a tiny little change that completely alters the information being conveyed by that sentence.
But what a mutation actually is information from one parent, information from another parent being put together, and it corrupts.
That is not what a mutation is. What Matt is describing here, badly, is crossing over, which is something that happens during meiosis when sperm and eggs are being produced. 2 homologous chromosomes, one from your mom and one from your dad, touch each other and literally swap chunks of one another with each other. And so you end up with 2 new recombinant chromosomes, which then get separated further into 2 individual chromatids. This is why you look a lot like your mom and your dad mixed together, and they look a lot like their parents, and so you look a little bit like your grandparents because they got it from their parents, and so on and so forth. But this isn't an example of mutation. This is just part of the process of making gametes. Crossing over can result in mutation. For example, if 2 non-homologous chromosomes cross over, then you can get what's called a translocation event, where a chunk of one chromosome ends up on another chromosome where it isn't supposed to be. That can happen, but to say that that's what always happens, or that this is the definition of what a mutation is just completely ridiculous.
That's what a mutation is a genetic corruption. It's deleterious to the gene code by definition.
It's technically allowable, I guess, to call a mutation a corruption like that. That's okay. But that's only because the word corruption just means to change something from its original form, which is what a mutation is. But that word carries a negative connotation with it that means that something is getting worse or being profaned in some way, and that just really doesn't apply here. Not all mutations are deleterious. And I can say that with great confidence because we classify some mutations as being deleterious. Why would we do that if they were all deleterious? That would be like me saying that all movies are horror movies by definition. It just makes no sense. Some mutations are deleterious, some mutations are beneficial, some mutations are silent and have no observable effect at all. So this just absolutely makes no sense, what he's saying here.
And so from generation to generation, we accumulate mutations as a human population.
Fans of this show probably caught that, but just in case, that's the definition of evolution. I don't know why, but we end up here a lot. Lots and lots of creationists love to define evolution while trying to deny its existence. But here we are again. A change in the heritable characteristics of a population over the course of successive generations is the literal textbook definition of evolution. So no matter where else Matt tries to go throughout the course of this video, just remember, he just explained evolution badly and then admitted that it was real.
And as we add mutations or errors into the code, because that's what a mutation even is, as you add errors in, things get worse in our bodies from generation to generation.
Again, not all mutations are bad. And also, if each generation was getting worse and worse, then we probably wouldn't expect to have the largest human population in history with the longest average lifespan in history. Now, would we?
And so the supposed best evidence genetically for evolution actually is some of the best evidence for creation, and it proves that we would have had to start out perfectly genetically, and then when man sinned, it got corrupted, and then from generation to generation, our genetics would get worse over time.
So he just made two totally new claims here, neither one of which is supported by any evidence whatsoever. The first is that our DNA started out perfect, and the second is that mutations are caused by sin. The thing is, even if I accepted Matt's absurd misunderstanding of what a mutation is, even if I stopped thinking for long enough to agree that human genetics is just deteriorating over successive generations, neither one of those points does anything to back up these new claims that he's just made. First of all, you'd have to demonstrate what perfect DNA is, which is a deeply problematic concept. Then you'd have to prove what sin is, both defining it and quantifying it in an objective way. Then you'd have to show a mechanism by which sin can alter not your DNA, but the DNA of your children. And then on top of all of that, you would have to demonstrate a new morality-dependent form of cell division that goes along with Matt's ludicrous model of how mutations work. Overall, there's about 20 years of missing genetics research and a massive suspension of the laws of nature standing in between Matt saying that and me having any reason to believe him.
And so in 2003, the Human Genome Project was completed, and they found that we actually lose 1 to 2% of our genetic information per generation as human beings.
Yeah, the Human Genome Project makes no such claim. If an embryo lost 1 to 2% of its DNA, it would die. Now, there are certain true things that almost kind of sound like that, so maybe he just grossly misunderstood something. Like, for example, around 60 to 80,000 years ago, as our species was leaving Africa, there was a bottleneck event that reduced our numbers significantly, and that cost us a lot of genetic diversity. So you could say that this was a loss of genetic information on like a species level, but even then, we got a lot of that back by interbreeding with other species of hominins, so it doesn't really track here either. I can't tell if Matt just like grossly misunderstood something that he heard, or if somebody just told him something insane and he believed it, or if he's just lying and pulling this out of his butt. Quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised no matter which one of those three it was.
And so, for example, my son has 1 to 2% less genetic information than I do, and his son will have 1 to 2% less genetic information than him.
So that's completely bonkers. And an easy way to understand why is to just put it into financial terms, right? This is depreciation. That's basically what he's talking about. You have a value that decreases by a set percentage, and then the new value decreases by that same percentage again over and over and over. It's basically like compounding interest, but backwards. I didn't want to bother with writing out a formula for this, so I just pulled up a percentage depreciation calculator here on goodcalculators.com. The original asset value here is how many base pairs or letters are in human DNA. The human genome contains about 3 billion base pairs. Each year represents a generation, and each generation, the value will decrease by 2%. So here at the beginning, we start off with 3 billion base pairs. This, in Matt's model, would represent Adam and Eve, right? The first 2 humans to ever reproduce. So the next generation would have 2% less genetic information from their parents, so that's 60 million base pairs that they just lost, leaving them with 2,940,000,000 base pairs. Then we just plug that number back into the same formula and run it again. By the 35th generation, children are being born with less than half of the DNA that their ancestors started out with. And by the time we get near 1,000 generations, we're down to single digits. Now remember, DNA is read in sequences of 3 letters called codons. Each codon codes for an amino acid to build a protein. So with single digits of DNA, you can have at most 9 letters, 3 codons. So at this point, your entire body is both made up of and run by 3 amino acids. And of course, this is assuming that there are no promoters or introns or enhancers or any other non-coding regulatory sequence of DNA, all of which are absolutely essential for DNA to function properly. We just leave those out. I just realized we can actually go further than that too. If we assume that everybody has the same 3 amino acids, then we can do a simple calculation of permutations with the possibility of repetition, right? And so that's just n to the power of r, where n is the total number of things being arranged and r is the number of things in each arrangement. So you've got 3 raised to the power of 3, which is 3 cubed is 27. So instead of the hundreds of thousands of different proteins that make up a human body, you've got 27 that account for all human physiology and variability. So I just found this article from Answers in Genesis that claims that there have been exactly 87 generations of humans since Adam and Eve, or at least that's what this guy's claiming. He says that he is the 87th generation, so his kids would be the 88th. That means that this guy would have around 517 million base pairs in his DNA. That's just over 17% of all the DNA that he's supposed to have. But wait, what if that's not what Matt means? What if Matt actually means that the 3 billion base pairs that we have today is the corrupted DNA, and that Adam and Eve would have had enough DNA back in the garden in order to leave us with only 3 billion base pairs today? I'm glad you asked, because I already typed it into the calculator. And if we had 87 generations with 2% reduction each generation, leaving us with 3 billion base pairs today, that would mean that Adam and Eve would have had to have started with 17.5 billion base pairs. What is that? That's almost 6 times as much DNA as we have today. Now remember, that whole concept of there only being 87 generations from the beginning of humankind to now comes from the fact that in the Bible it claims that before the flood people lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the actual human generation time is about 25 years. So they think that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and we plug in 25 years to that, and that brings us up to 240 generations. So if we were to say that there have been 240 generations, losing 2% of our DNA along the way, that means that we would have had to have started with 400 billion base pairs. That's over 133 times what our DNA is today. Here's a fun science fact. if you take all the DNA out of any one of your cells, except for the cells that don't have DNA, which are erythrocytes and fortified cells, whatever. If I took all the DNA out of any one of my random cells that has it, it would stretch out to be about 6 feet long. That's almost as tall as me. That's a crazy, fun, cool science fact. Can you imagine what it would be like if every single one of your cells had 133 times more DNA? Can you picture how beefy every single one of your cells would have? Adam and Eve were swole. I can't get this image out of my head of this talking snake offering a magical fruit to these two naked people who are just yoked to the gills. Like, this is one of those things that it doesn't exactly take a biology degree to see that it's completely ridiculous, right? Like, I happen to think math is fun, so we went a little crazy with it. But honestly, if you think about what Matt is saying for 2 seconds here, it completely falls apart. And this dude took the time to write it, to say it, to edit it, and to post it on the internet, and never once thought about the ramifications of what it meant.
So, as genetic information gets lost, as mutations accumulate in the genetic code, things will only get worse for us over time. Now, evolutionists claim that things get better over time, and that we started out simple and that we got more complex through mutations. But what mutations actually do is cause errors and problems in the genetic code, and that's why we have things like Down syndrome or even autism. Those were caused by genetic mutations that were deleterious and caused genetics to fail in certain of the human population. And so autism and certain diseases are actually increasing over time as we accumulate genetic mutations.
Oh, we were having so much fun. And then he just opened his mouth again. There's a lot wrong with what he just said. I'm going to try to cover all of it. We'll start with autism. There is pretty clear evidence of some genetic component behind autism. If I remember correctly, there's about 30 to 60% of cases that show some positive genetic link, but there are over 1,000 different genes that are currently being studied that could predispose somebody to autism. So this is a frontier in neuroscience research. It is something that the brightest people out there are just starting to get a handle on and figure out how we can learn more about this. For him to just say that he knows how it works and it's just mutations, it's just a buildup of mutations. It's not even good enough to call that a gross misrepresentation of reality. That is just the height of irresponsibility and complete arrogance. Also, he said something in there about how we're seeing an increase of the cases of all of these genetic diseases or whatever. But to imply that cases of autism are on the rise is to simply not understand how research works at all. We are seeing an increase in the diagnosis of autism, but diagnoses are not necessarily the same thing as cases. People with autism have always been here, but we've just been tracking autism for the past, 20 or so years? And in that time, we've changed the diagnostic criteria quite a bit, and we've had several awareness campaigns. So autism is being diagnosed more rapidly and more readily and more efficiently. Cases are not on the rise, and the people who are doing this research are very clear about that. Like, that's as stupid of a thing to say as if he were to say that if we just stopped testing people for COVID, we would see COVID cases going down. Like, it's just completely brainless. Now, as far as Down syndrome is concerned, that is caused by a single mutation. It's called a chromosomal non-disjunction event, and it occurs during meiosis. While sperm and egg cells are being developed, chromosome number 21 just doesn't quite separate properly, and so the resulting gamete has an extra copy of that chromosome. And so the resulting embryo gets an extra copy of that chromosome. And that's why we call Down syndrome trisomy 21, because it's 3 copies of chromosome number 21. So that is a mutation, but it's not something that's usually heritable. That is very, very, very rare. Less than 1% of all cases of Down syndrome are passed on from parent to offspring. It is a completely random event that can occur in any developing sex cell. So for him to claim that Down syndrome is the result of some buildup of mutations is beyond preposterous. You would have to know literally nothing about what Down syndrome is and how it works to say something like that. So that whole segment right there was just irresponsible, contemptible gibberish. Absolute meaningless word salad that does nothing but stigmatize two groups that don't deserve it in order to use them as a footstool to prop up this brainless, pointless, baseless argument. Just real gross.
So when an evolutionist says that mutations are somehow proof that we're evolving, they don't even know, they're literally admitting that they don't even know what a mutation is. Because a mutation, by the very definition, is a copying error. That's what the definition of a mutation even is.
Ignoring how incredibly pompous it is for Matt to say that the people who spend their whole lives studying mutations must just not know how mutations work, especially after he just got done showing that he has no idea how mutations work, it's really important to focus on the language that he's using here and why he's using it. Mutations are often described as errors, but really they're just any change in the DNA sequence for any number of reasons. So he could just be using the word change, but he's not. He's deliberately using the word error because error brings with it this negative connotation that something has gone wrong. And that helps him prop up his argument that all mutations are errors and therefore all errors are bad and they can't possibly produce anything good. And in case it isn't abundantly clear why that's a silly argument to make, pacemakers, penicillin, and chocolate chip cookies were all invented by accident, through errors, deviation from the plan. The inventors messed something up and made these wonderful things. So by Matt's definition of error, they deviated from their perfect design, so these must all be bad things, right? See how dumb that is? Error doesn't necessarily mean bad. It just means different, and different can be good.
So by all these errors, somehow we have a perfect genetic code for humans now.
Hold up. I thought our genetics wasn't perfect, and that we were losing genetic information with each passing generation. Which one is it? Are we perfect or not?
That's their logic.
No, it isn't.
Is that genetics mutated from a frog to a prince over millions of years. That is completely unscientific on every single level.
It is completely unscientific, Matt. That's why nobody's saying it but you.
And just the fact that somebody would think that mutations somehow cause perfection and that we would get a perfect human species millions of years later, folks, it just goes to show they don't even care what science is. If they cared, they would look at the definition of words before throwing out those words as supposed best evidence genetically for evolution.
So first of all, the only one here that's claiming that anyone or anything is perfect is this guy. Scientists and communicators tend not to use words like perfect unless we're speaking to a general audience or just talking colloquially, because this is a subjective term. What does it really even mean in the grand scheme of things? So nothing in nature is perfect any more than anything in nature is good or evil. It just is. But since Matt is so adamant that we look up the definition of words before we throw them out, let's look up the definition of perfect. Having all the required or desirable elements, qualities, or characteristics, as good as it is possible to be. This raises the question, are humans as good as we can possibly be? Let's think about that. Our third molars, often called our wisdom teeth, don't fit into our jaws properly. So they cause a bunch of crowding in our other teeth, which leads to unnecessary decay, or they just create abscesses, which are excruciatingly painful or could even lead to death. The opening of our pelvises is too narrow for the size of the head of a baby, so your pelvis has to split and separate during childbirth, which is extremely painful even when childbirth goes well, which is not too common. Our testicles are completely exposed. Other mammals like whales and hippos keep theirs tucked up inside their abdomen, which is way safer and more streamlined. Why do we have ours on the outside? They start inside the inguinal canal. Just leave them there. What, they have to come out for thermoregulation? Just make more stable gonads, dude. The way that our optic nerve connects to the back of our retina leaves a huge blind spot in our vision that our brains just have to ignore all the time. Cephalopods don't have that. Their eyes are way better, way more perfect than ours are. Why do we only get 2 sets of teeth? There are some animals that never stop making them. There are some animals that never stop growing them. Why is it that I have to pay for fillings when sharks are out here just dropping teeth like loose change? All human urethras are stupid. Mine goes through my prostate instead of just going around it, which is handy for flow control, but it means that if my prostate ever gets inflamed or infected, which is very common in humans, I might not be able to pee, which can lead to several other painful health conditions. Meanwhile, somebody with female anatomy has perfectly good pelvic floor muscles, so they've got their flow control right there. They don't need the prostate, but those pelvic floor muscles often get damaged during childbirth, so they're gonna pee themselves every time they cough. Plus, their urethra is so freaking short, they're gonna get urinary tract infections all the time. The vagus nerve runs from my brain, down my neck, around my heart, and back up to my larynx just to control my voice box. We even call this the recurrent laryngeal branch. That doesn't sound like a perfect design. That sounds like a dumb and wasteful design. And while we're at it, whose idea was it to put the eating tube right next to the breathing tube or the waste dump right next to the playground? Who thought that was smart? Evolution actually explains these things and backs up those explanations with evidence. Matt's perfect design model, by comparison, falls pretty flat.
And evolutionists always like to claim that natural selection somehow disproves God, and it proves that evolution is somehow true.
As I said in my video about Kevin Anderson, nobody is trying to disprove your God. We are just ignoring an unfounded and unnecessary hypothesis. You're not oppressed, you're just wrong.
But just the phrase natural selection literally proves that the genetics have to do some selecting, or they have to make a choice. That's what select even means, hence the phrase natural selection.
So this is a very common misconception. Who's doing the selecting, right? But that's not actually what natural selection means. Natural selection is just unequal reproductive success. It's the differential rate of survival and reproduction of individuals based on their phenotypes, which causes a change in the allele frequencies of the population across multiple generations. So yes, the word selection is anthropomorphizing that process, but that doesn't actually literally mean that there's any intelligent agent in charge.
And so selection requires consciousness. Choices require consciousness. And it's not natural randomization.
Here again, he's just conflating the words choice and selection. They do not mean the same thing in this context. As I said before, this is a very, very common misconception, but if you're going to try to debunk something on the internet, you should probably learn what it is first.
Folks, it just goes to show they don't even care what science is. If they cared, they would look at the definition of words before throwing out those words.
Natural selection, a natural process that results in the survival and reproductive success of individuals or groups best adjusted to their environment that leads to the perpetuation of genetic qualities best suited to that particular environment. Nothing in there about choice or agency or intelligent design or anything like that. You know, you should really look up the meaning of these words before you just throw them out like that.
If it was a dead, unconscious process that came about through spontaneous generation, there wouldn't be any conscious coding involved.
There isn't any conscious coding involved. So we're on the same page, it seems.
But just the phrase natural selection proves that there's genes that are selected, and hence a choice is made. God programmed our genetics to be able to make choices, and selection can only occur when there's a mind behind it. And so even the phrase natural selection points to intelligent design and disproves atheistic evolution at the fundamental of the phrase and of genetics.
First of all, what is that sentence? It disproves atheistic evolution at the fundamental of the phrase and of genetics. That's not how words work. You said that and then watched it back and edited it and heard it and decided that it was okay to put on the internet. Why? More importantly, however, phrasing doesn't prove anything. I can't believe I have to say this, but the way that we say words doesn't have anything to do with the truth of those words. It tells us nothing beyond the fact that that is what we call those things. For example, the names of many of the days of the week in English are derived from the names of Norse gods, but Thor does not exist because it's Thursday. The word cereal is derived from the name of the Roman goddess of agriculture, Ceres, but frosted flakes do not prove her existence. Koala bears aren't bears, a titmouse is neither a breast nor a rodent, and the Pope of Poop must not be praised simply because I said holy crap, Matt. All that being said, if you think that the way that we say words counts as scientific evidence for how the universe works, it makes a lot more sense why you would believe in the Bible.
And so I hope you guys enjoyed this video.
I didn't.
And I hope that you guys have seen that by one man's sin, death entered into the world, and death by sin.
You didn't address that whatsoever, so there's no way that we could have seen that from this video. But also, what? By one man's sin, death entered into the world, and death by sin. Did you just have a stroke, or did I?
And so sin was what actually caused genetic mutations and genetic failures and copying errors, not evolution making things better, but sin causing genetic information to get lost and to deteriorate over time, which is what we would predict anyways in the biblical model. Let me know if you guys have any questions down in the comment section below, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. God bless, guys.
Let's ignore how completely absurd that whole statement is for just a second and focus on the big picture here. Matt makes 3 major claims over the course of this video. The first is that mutations are caused by sin. The second is that mutations are always bad. And the third is that mutations cause things like Down syndrome and autism, which he doubles down on here by pinning his own comment in his comment section. So his whole thesis statement is that we are sinning, which is causing our genetics to deteriorate to the point where children are being born with autism and Down syndrome. What an absolutely disgusting thing to say. Autism and Down syndrome are things that aren't really comparable, except for the fact that you're either born with them or you're not. But in any regard, they are not diseases to be cured. This is probably the thing that activists and advocates in these communities are the most vocal about. But then again, I'm not really surprised to find that Matt hasn't spent any time listening to any opinions other than his own. As for me, I'm a big proponent of the phrase, nothing about us without us, so I'm going to link some resources in the description here from the National Down Syndrome Society and the Autism Self-Advocacy Network that teach a little bit about what these conditions are, how they work, the people who have them, and most importantly, how they would like to be referred to and talked about. Because when we're talking about these people, it's really important to remember that they are people, not statistics, not problems, not props. So we should use the kind of language that they would like us to use when talking about them. Because, that's a decent human thing to do. As for what Matt was actually saying here at the very end of the video, even if I were to agree with him on what does and doesn't constitute a disease or whatever, any system that would give children genetic diseases in order to account for the wrongdoings of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents is stupid and evil. And I am very happy to know that there's no evidence for anything like that existing in the universe. And this last claim here about being able to use a biblical model to predict genetic deterioration, you cannot use a biblical model to predict anything about genetics because there's nothing about genetics in the Bible. And the reason why there's nothing about genetics in the Bible is because the people who wrote the Bible didn't know anything about genetics. If they had known about genetics, they probably wouldn't have put so much incest in there. Like, you don't even have to think about all of the different stories with it. Just think about the first one. Adam and Eve had 3 sons. And then those sons got wives. Those would have either had to have been their sisters or their daughters. More likely both at the same time. Maybe their nieces? Best case scenario? Either way, gross. What a moral story. Overall, I give this video a Science Teacher Challenge level 1 out of 10. I'll be honest, I did not have high expectations going into this, and somehow, I was still disappointed. That's one thing I can say about Matt Powell. He is a difficult person to underestimate. And with that, I'm Forrest Valkai. Thank you so much for watching, for liking, for commenting, for subscribing, and all the other stuff you do here on YouTube. Please exit through the gift shop on your way out. Pick up one of these sweet t-shirts. If you like terrible podcasts, I've got one of those linked down below as well. Have an awesome rest of your day, and never stop learning. Bye-bye.
Dude, it's not a joke. You're a skinny little runt baby that can't think for himself. Dude, you will go to hell! I am not joking. Look at me.
Matt, stop.
Look at me.
Stop.
You look at me right now.
Stop. I came here.
We are going to talk about this.
You're going to smile.
You are insane. You think I am yelling too hard? You have lost your mind.
Stop.
You're going to talk to me.
No.
You're going to talk to me right now.
I'm getting out of
You're
here.
acting like a woman. Why don't you talk to me like a man?
Acting like a woman. I came here for the stupid
You're
window.
acting like a woman, dude.